The woman screaming at the police boat that morning had no idea the lake she was fighting over was about to destroy her entire HOA. The first thing I heard was the sound of sirens echoing across the water at 5:43 in the morning. Not city sirens. Marine patrol sirens. The kind that bounce off still water and roll through fog like distant thunder. I was standing ankle-deep at the edge of Blackwater Ridge Lake holding a rusted steel chain in one hand and a thermos of burnt coffee in the other when red and blue lights exploded through the mist. The cold air smelled like wet cedar, engine oil, and freshwater mud. Somewhere behind me, an old dock creaked softly against the shoreline with every tiny ripple moving through the lake. Then came the shouting. That's him right there. Vanessa Holloway's voice sliced through the fog before I could even see her face. He's trespassing on private HOA property. I took a slow sip of coffee while the patrol boat drifted toward shore. Funny thing was, I technically owned every inch of water beneath them. The officers stepped off carefully onto the damp wooden dock while their flashlights swept across the fog like search beams. One of them rested a hand near his radio while staring at me like he was trying to figure out whether this was a criminal complaint or another rich neighborhood meltdown. Behind them sat Vanessa Holloway wrapped in a white designer jacket that probably cost more than my fishing boat. Her blonde hair looked perfect despite the humidity, and even from 30 feet away, I could smell her expensive perfume mixing badly with gasoline fumes from the Marina generators behind her. The entire Silver Pines Marina glowed in the distance like a floating country club. Yacht lights reflected across the black water, while rows of million-dollar boats rocked gently in their slips. You could still hear music from whatever champagne party those people had been throwing all night. Vanessa pointed at me with perfectly manicured nails. He cut the gate chain and illegally entered restricted HOA property. I looked down at the bolt cutter sitting beside my boots and almost laughed. "Ma'am," the older patrol officer said. "Carefully. This man called before you did." Her face tightened instantly. That was my favorite part. See, 40 minutes earlier, before the screaming and before the sirens, I had already contacted the county marine office myself. I learned a long time ago that when entitled people think they own something, they usually call the police first and ask questions later. The older officer stepped toward me. "Sir, can I see your identification?" I handed him my driver's license along with a folded packet sealed inside a waterproof plastic sleeve. The texture of old survey paper still felt rough against my fingers every time I touched it. The officer opened the packet slowly while Vanessa crossed her arms with a smug smile already forming. Then the smile disappeared. I watched his flashlight pause over the federal seal printed across the top page. United States Army Corps of Engineers. Shoreline Access Registry. Ownership Transfer Authorization. The younger officer leaned closer immediately. "Wait," he muttered. "This is federally registered water access." "Since 1974, I answered calmly. The silence afterward felt heavy. Even the music from the marina suddenly seemed quieter. Vanessa blinked twice like her brain was struggling to catch up. "That's impossible," she snapped. "Our HOA has operated this marina for 15 years. I nodded slowly. "Exactly." The officer looked back toward the marina stretching across the eastern shoreline. For long docks, private fuel pumps, permanent slips, hundreds of feet of floating platforms connected directly to federally regulated flood control water. I could practically see the realization crawling across his face. Vanessa kept talking anyway. People like her always do. "This man is harassing residents and threatening community operations," she said sharply. "He bought abandoned land with a dead lake, and now he's trying to extort homeowners." Dead lake. That phrase sat in my chest heavier than I expected. Because Blackwater Ridge was never dead. Neglected maybe. Forgotten definitely. But not dead. My father used to bring me here every summer before sunrise. Back when the old floodgate still worked and the north shoreline had not. Been buried behind luxury homes and fake palm trees. I could still remember the smell of his tackle box. The sound of aluminum boat seats rattling against the trailer hitch. The way fog rolled across the water exactly like it was rolling now. Most people saw worthless swamp water surrounded by dying timber. I saw the last thing my father ever loved before cancer took him. The older officer handed my paperwork back carefully. His tone changed completely. "Sir, according to this registry, you are the legal shoreline owner." Vanessa actually laughed out loud. Not nervous laughter either. Real disbelief. You cannot seriously expect me to believe this man owns the lake. I looked directly at her for the first time that morning. No, I said quietly. I expect you to understand that you built a private marina on federally protected water without permission. For a second, nobody spoke. The only sound came from waves slapping softly against the dock pilings and a distant generator humming from one of the yachts. Then Vanessa's face lost all color. Because right then, standing in the cold fog with federal paperwork in my hands and police lights reflecting across the water, she finally realized this was no longer an HOA argument. This was federal waterway law, and her entire marina was sitting directly in the middle of it. The strange thing about silence around a lake is that it never stays silent for long. By noon that same day, the entire shoreline around Blackwater Ridge was buzzing like somebody kicked over a hornet nest. Golf carts rolled up and down the private roads inside Silver Pines Marina estates. Boat engines rumbled nonstop near the docks. I could hear snippets of angry conversations floating across the water while I worked alone beside the old maintenance shed near the western shoreline. The air smelled like sun-baked cedar, gasoline, and algae warming under the Texas heat. Every few minutes, another resident slowed their luxury pontoon boat near my property line just to stare at me like I was some kind of criminal who wandered into their country club by accident. I kept working anyway. That old maintenance shed had belonged to my father before the lake fell apart. The roof still sagged slightly on the north side where storm damage hit it back in 2008. Rusted hooks lined the walls inside. Old fishing nets still hung beside shelves filled with cracked tackle boxes and faded flood maps. Every inch of that place smelled like motor oil and old wood soaked in decades of lake water. Most people would have seen junk. To me, it smelled like childhood. My name is Lucas Mercer. I am 38 years old, former Army Corps hydraulic systems engineer, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, I was finally back where I belonged. My father bought access rights to Blackwater Ridge in 1989 when the lake still mattered. Back before the luxury homes showed up. Back before the marina bars and floating restaurants and oversized vacation houses wrapped around the shoreline like parasites feeding off the water. Dad was not rich. Not even close. He repaired flood control pumps for the county and spent every extra dollar restoring neglected waterways nobody else cared about anymore. He used to tell me that lakes were like people. Ignore them long enough, and eventually they stop fighting to survive. Some of my earliest memories came from this water. I still remember sitting beside him at sunrise wrapped in an oversized camouflage jacket while fog drifted low across the surface. The smell of black coffee mixed with fish bait and diesel fuel from his old aluminum boat. The sound of waves tapping gently against the hull while he explained water pressure, dam gates, and shoreline erosion to a 10-year-old kid who barely understood any of it. But I listened anyway because Dad talked about lakes the way some people talk about religion, like they deserved respect. Then the developers arrived. Around 2005, Silver Pines Marina Estates started swallowing the eastern shoreline piece by piece. Wealthy retirees, corporate investors, vacation rentals, people who wanted waterfront sunsets without understanding the water itself. They built luxury docks over protected runoff zones, replaced cypress trees with decorative stone walkways, installed fuel pumps 50 feet from spawning beds, and slowly, Blackwater Ridge stopped being a real lake and started becoming scenery for rich people holding wine glasses on oversized patios. Dad hated it. I remember one afternoon when we watched construction crews cut through shoreline reeds with excavators while muddy runoff poured into the water like chocolate syrup. He stood there silently gripping the steering wheel of his truck so hard his knuckles turned white. They think money makes them owners, he muttered. But water does not care how expensive your house is. He died 4 years later. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and ugly. By the time I finished my second infrastructure contract with the Army Corps in Louisiana, the lake was nearly forgotten. The marina thrived while the western shoreline collapsed into neglect. County maintenance stopped. Public access disappeared. The old floodgate station shut down entirely after funding cuts. Eventually, the original owners sold what remained of the lake rights through a quiet foreclosure auction that barely made local news. Nobody wanted polluted water surrounded by legal complications and failing infrastructure. Nobody except me. I bought Blackwater Ridge 6 months ago for less than most people in Silver Pines spent on a second boat slip. 43 acres of shoreline rights, maintenance easements, spillway access, and federal flood control responsibility bundled together in paperwork, so old most lawyers would not bother reading it. But I did. Every line, every map, every buried federal clause connected to Army Corps shoreline jurisdiction. That was the difference between me and people like Vanessa Holloway. She saw the lake as decoration. I saw infrastructure. And infrastructure always leaves a paper trail. The first time I drove back onto the property after closing the sale, I parked beside the old launch ramp and just sat there listening. No music, no phone calls, just wind moving through dead reeds and water slapping softly against broken dock posts. The lake smelled different than I remembered. Dirtier, heavy with gasoline and stagnant algae near the Marina's side. But underneath all of it, buried beneath the chemical smell and years of neglect, Blackwater Ridge still smelled alive. That mattered to me more than money ever could. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard tires crunching slowly over gravel behind me. I already knew who it was before I turned around. Vanessa Holloway stepped out of her white Range Rover wearing oversized sunglasses and another perfectly pressed white outfit that looked ridiculous beside rusted boat trailers and cracked concrete. Heat shimmered around the hood of her SUV while distant yacht music echoed across the lake behind her. She removed her sunglasses slowly. "You embarrassed me this morning," she said coldly. I wiped grease from my hands with an old rag and looked past her toward the marina stretching across the opposite shoreline. Jet skis carved white lines through the water while marina employees loaded coolers onto rented pontoons. Nobody over there looked worried yet, but they would. "No," I answered calmly. "The paperwork embarrassed you." Her jaw tightened instantly. Then she glanced toward the old maintenance shed behind me with visible disgust. "You seriously think you can stop this community from using the lake?" I looked down at the faded federal shoreline markers half buried near the waterline. Small metal posts everyone ignored because they looked old and unimportant. Funny thing was, those little markers were about to become the most expensive mistake Silver Pines Marina Estates had ever made. By the next weekend, Silver Pines Marina Estates stopped pretending I existed and started treating me like an enemy. You could feel it in the air the second you drove near the eastern shoreline. The security guards watched my truck longer than necessary whenever I passed the marina entrance. Conversation stopped when I walked into the bait shop beside the fuel dock. Even the waitresses at the little lakeside grill suddenly acted nervous serving coffee to the guy who apparently wanted to destroy the community. Funny how fast rich people turn a stranger into a villain once property rights interrupt their cocktail parties. The smear campaign really started on Saturday morning. I found out because my phone would not stop vibrating while I was repairing the old shoreline pump station behind the maintenance shed. The smell of rusted steel and lake mud filled the air while dragonflies hovered above the reeds beside me. Sweat rolled down my neck under the Texas heat as notification after notification lit up my screen. Somebody had posted my photograph inside the Silver Pines community group. Not just a normal picture either. Vanessa had uploaded a close-up image of me standing near the marina gates during the police incident with a caption calling me a dangerous trespasser attempting to seize community property. Hundreds of comments flooded underneath it within hours. Probably trying to extort the HOA. Why would anybody buy a dead lake? He looks unstable. This is why property values collapse. I stared at the screen for a long moment while cicadas screamed from the trees overhead. Then I laughed quietly to myself because every single comment revealed the exact same thing. None of those people had ever bothered checking who legally owned the water sitting behind their mansions. They just assumed the marina belonged to them because it always had. That was the real disease eating places like Silver Pines. Entitlement so deep it rewrote reality. Around noon, I drove toward the marina fuel station to pick up hydraulic fluid for the old floodgate system. The moment my tires rolled onto the paved access road, 2 private security carts cut directly in front of my truck. Gravel popped under their tires while both guards stepped out wearing matching navy polo shirts with Silver Pines security stitched across the chest. One of them held a clipboard like he was auditioning to become a federal agent. "Residents only beyond this point," he said stiffly. I glanced past him toward the water. Families loaded coolers onto rental pontoons while kids jumped from the docks laughing. Expensive wake boats floated beside polished cedar slips. Somewhere nearby, country music drifted through outdoor speakers mixed with the sharp smell of gasoline and grilled burgers. I own the shoreline, I replied calmly. The younger guard shifted awkwardly. He knew it too. You could see it in his face. But the older one kept pushing anyway. The HOA controls marina operations. I looked directly at the giant sign hanging over the entrance. Silver Pines Private Marina. Members only. Bright polished letters mounted on treated wood directly inside federally protected shoreline easement markers. That sign alone was probably worth 6 figures in future legal penalties. Interesting, I said quietly. You may want to photograph that before they remove it. The older guard frowned like he did not understand what I meant. Most people around here did not. Because most people hear the words federal waterway law and immediately stop listening. They think lakes are simple. They are not. Especially not flood control lakes tied into Army Corps spillway systems. I turned my truck around without another word and headed back toward the western shoreline. Let them feel confident. Arrogant people make expensive mistakes when they think they already won. Later that evening, I sat alone at the end of the old dock while the sunset turned the water deep orange beneath the marina lights across the lake. The dock groaned softly under my boots while wind carried the distant sound of laughter and clinking wine glasses from Silver Pines. I could see Vanessa hosting another lakeside gathering near the clubhouse patio. White dresses, expensive boats, decorative fire pits glowing beside the water. They looked like a commercial for luxury real estate. But once you understood infrastructure, the illusion disappeared fast. Because underneath the pretty lights and floating docks sat aging shoreline barriers nobody maintained properly. Fuel lines installed too close to runoff channels. Floating platforms anchored directly over protected spillway access routes. The entire marina was basically a federal violation floating on borrowed time. My father would have noticed it immediately. The strange thing was, I do not think Vanessa Holloway started out evil. People like her usually do not. They just spend too many years getting away with small abuses until eventually they stop recognizing limits. Vanessa had controlled Silver Pines for nearly a decade. Her husband, Richard Holloway, sat on the county planning commission. Local contractors donated to HOA projects. Marina businesses sponsored neighborhood events. The entire place operated like a tiny waterfront kingdom where rules only applied to outsiders. And now suddenly some quiet engineer with work boots and old flood maps showed up holding ownership documents nobody thought still mattered. That terrified her more than she would ever admit. Around 9 that night, headlights rolled slowly down the dirt path leading toward my shoreline. A black luxury SUV stopped near the dock while dust drifted through the warm night air. Richard Holloway stepped out first. Tall, gray-haired, perfect polo shirt tucked into pressed khakis. The kind of man who smelled faintly like expensive cologne and political donations. Vanessa climbed out behind him wearing the same frozen smile she always used before saying something cruel. I stayed seated at the edge of the dock while small waves tapped softly against the wood beneath me. Richard approached carefully with both hands in his pockets. "Lucas," he said calmly, "we got off on the wrong foot." I almost smiled at that, because people only say things like that when they are about to offer money or threats. Usually both. He glanced toward the marina lights reflecting across the water. Silver Pines has invested millions into this lake community. Vanessa crossed her arms beside him. You could make this very easy on yourself. There it was. Not an apology. Not compromise. Ownership. They still thought this was about buying silence from somebody beneath them. I looked out across the dark water where the marina lights shimmered like broken glass. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten slightly. Near the northern dock extension, a faint rainbow sheen floated across the surface under the lights. Fuel residue. Fresh. Thin streaks drifting slowly through protected runoff current heading west toward the flood channels. My eyes stayed fixed on the water while Richard continued talking behind me about partnerships and community cooperation. But I barely heard him anymore, because suddenly the smell of gasoline cutting through the night air told me something important. Silver Pines Marina was not just violating shoreline law. They were contaminating federally regulated water. The next morning, the smell hit me before I even reached the northern shoreline. Gasoline. Sharp and chemical heavy. It floated across the humid morning air strong enough to overpower the usual scent of lake water and wet cedar. I killed the engine on my truck and stepped out slowly while fog still hovered low across Blackwater Ridge. Somewhere near the marina, yacht engines rumbled awake one by one like distant generators. The entire eastern shoreline was already coming alive with weekend traffic. Golf carts buzzing along paved paths. Dock workers hauling coolers. Music drifting faintly across the water from outdoor speakers mounted beside luxury patios. But out near the protected runoff channel, everything felt wrong. The water itself looked wrong. Thin rainbow streaks spread across the surface near the northern spillway current, shimmering under the sunrise like spilled paint. Dead shad floated belly up near the reeds while oily foam collected against broken timber posts along the shoreline. I crouched near the edge of the water and dipped 2 fingers into the surface. Slick residue coated my skin immediately. Fresh fuel contamination. Recent. The kind that happens when marina systems leak directly into runoff channels. I stood there quietly listening to water lap against the rocks while anger settled slowly into my chest. Because now this was bigger than property rights. Bigger than HOA harassment. These idiots were poisoning federally controlled floodwater tide directly into county agricultural runoff systems, which meant somebody at Silver Pines had crossed from civil violations into environmental territory. And federal agencies do not play games once contamination enters protected waterways. I drove straight toward the Marina office. The security gate opened halfway before stopping suddenly with a loud metallic clank. One of the guards jogged toward my truck, already sweating through his navy uniform shirt. "Mr. Holloway said you are not allowed on marina property." I glanced past him toward the fuel dock sitting less than 200 feet from the runoff current. The smell of gasoline was even stronger here. Boat traffic rocked the floating docks while marina employees rushed around pretending everything looked normal. "Interesting," I muttered quietly. "You may want to tell him the Environmental Protection Agency usually disagrees with private gate policies." The guard frowned nervously. Before he could answer, Vanessa herself stormed out of the marina office wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a clipboard against her chest like a weapon. Her heels clicked sharply against the dock planks while 2 marina employees followed behind her looking terrified. "You need to leave immediately," she snapped. "You are harassing residents again." I pointed toward the sheen spreading across the water near the fuel pumps. "You have contamination entering protected flood channels." Her expression did not change at all, not even slightly. That was the moment I realized she already knew. Vanessa folded her arms slowly. "That lake has looked like that for years." The marina employee standing behind her glanced downward immediately. Tiny reactions matter, especially when people are lying. I stepped closer to the shoreline markers beside the dock entrance. The old federal posts barely stood 3 feet tall now, weather faded and partially covered in vines. Most residents probably assumed they were random utility stakes. They were not. Those markers defined protected water control boundaries connected directly to Army Corps jurisdiction. And Silver Pines Marina had built half its luxury dock system directly across them. "You should probably stop talking," I said calmly. "Every sentence is becoming evidence." Vanessa actually laughed at me, loud enough for nearby residents to hear. "Evidence of what?" A washed-up engineer pretending he owns a swamp. Several people standing near the bait shop chuckled awkwardly beside her. That was the moment she made her biggest mistake so far. Because arrogance makes people careless. And careless people keep records they should destroy. I looked past Vanessa toward the marina maintenance building near the fuel station. A large white tank sat behind the structure connected to underground pump lines feeding the dock fueling system. Fresh dark stains streaked down one side of the concrete pad beneath it. The texture of cracked runoff channels leading downhill toward the water suddenly caught my attention too. Fuel drainage, directly toward protected shoreline current. Nobody around me even noticed what they were standing beside. But hydraulic engineers notice flow patterns instinctively. Water always tells the truth eventually. Vanessa stepped closer until her perfume mixed sickeningly with gasoline fumes blowing off the marina docks. "You are not welcome here," she whispered coldly. "This community was perfectly fine before you showed up." I stared at the fuel sheen drifting farther across the water behind her. Tiny ripples carried rainbow streaks directly toward the western flood channels feeding downstream farmland outside county limits. Dad used to warn me about this exact scenario when I was a kid. Rich developments always assume contamination disappears once it floats out of sight. But water keeps moving, and eventually the bill comes due. I pulled my phone from my pocket and started recording slowly while walking toward the shoreline markers. Immediately, one of the Marina employees panicked. "Ma'am," he muttered nervously toward Vanessa. "Maybe we should call maintenance." She ignored him completely. "You cannot film private property." "Actually," I replied calmly, "federal runoff zones are not private property." Her face tightened instantly. There it was again, that tiny flicker of fear hiding beneath the entitlement. She finally understood this situation was slipping outside HOA control. You cannot find your way out of federal contamination problems. Around us, residents kept loading boats and coolers completely unaware of what was happening beneath their marina. Children laughed near the kayak launch. Music played softly across the water. Champagne bottles clinked from an upper deck party already starting before noon. The entire place looked peaceful from a distance. But beneath the floating docks and polished cedar railings sat leaking fuel systems, unlicensed shoreline structures, and years of ignored runoff violations connected directly into protected floodwater. I slowly backed away from the shoreline while still recording everything. Vanessa watched me the entire time without blinking. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying another heavy wave of gasoline smell across the marina. Even some residents nearby finally noticed. Heads started turning toward the water. Quiet conversations spread across the docks. And standing there beside the federal shoreline markers with contamination floating behind her million-dollar marina, Vanessa Holloway finally looked nervous for the very first time. Because deep down, she knew exactly what kind of trouble starts once federal water inspectors begin asking questions. The county office smelled like burned coffee, old paper, and air conditioning that barely worked. I remember standing under flickering fluorescent lights holding a folder full of contamination photos, while two clerks behind the front desk avoided eye contact like I had walked in carrying a live grenade. Outside the narrow windows, rain clouds rolled slowly across the afternoon sky above Blackwater Ridge. The weather matched my mood perfectly. Heavy, tense, waiting for something ugly to break loose. I had spent 3 straight days documenting everything around Silver Pines Marina. Fuel residue drifting through runoff channels. Dock anchors placed directly inside protected flood easements. Illegal shoreline expansion extending almost 40 feet beyond the original federal survey markers. I photographed dead fish, recorded water samples, logged timestamps. Every piece of evidence sat neatly organized inside my binder the same way the Army Corps trained us during infrastructure investigations. Facts first, emotions later. The older county clerk finally sighed and took the paperwork from my hands like it physically annoyed him. His reading glasses slid halfway down his nose while he flipped through the photographs. "This is extensive," he muttered carefully. "It gets worse near the northern spillway," I answered. "Contamination is moving west into protected runoff channels." He nodded slowly, but never actually looked at me. "Well," he said awkwardly, "environmental complaints usually take time." That phrase instantly raised every alarm bell in my head. Usually take time. Translation: somebody already made phone calls. Sure. Enough. 10 minutes later, I heard polished dress shoes approaching across the tile floor behind me. Richard Holloway. The smell of expensive cologne hit before his voice did. "Lucas," he said smoothly. "Funny running into you here." I turned slowly while thunder rumbled faintly outside the building. Richard stood beside the county planning director like they had just finished a golf game together. Both men smiled the exact same way politicians smile, before lying directly to your face. "We are all trying to find reasonable solutions," Richard continued calmly. "No need to escalate misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. That word almost made me laugh. I pulled one of the contamination photographs from the binder and slid it across the counter toward him. Rainbow fuel sheen drifting through federally regulated runoff water. Timestamped. GPS logged. Impossible to deny. Richard barely glanced at it. Marinas occasionally experience maintenance runoff. Federal runoff zones are not maintenance issues, I replied quietly. The room went silent again except for the low buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Even the clerks stopped typing. Richard's smile tightened slightly. There it was again. That tiny crack underneath the confidence. Because people like Richard Holloway survive by controlling local systems. HOA boards, planning offices, permit approvals, neighborhood politics. But federal agencies sit outside those little kingdoms entirely. He leaned closer toward me, lowering his voice. You need to understand something about Silver Pines. Hundreds of families invested their lives here. Rain finally started tapping softly against the county office windows behind him. And you need to understand something about federal floodwater, I answered. It does not care about property values. The planning director suddenly cleared his throat awkwardly and stepped between us. Mr. Mercer, he said carefully, we will review the complaint. I already knew what that meant. Delay tactics, quiet calls, paperwork disappearing into administrative limbo while Silver Pines kept operating normally. Sure enough, by the following morning, nothing changed at the marina except the hostility. Actually, hostility might not even be the right word anymore. It felt coordinated now. The bait shop refused service when I stopped for ice. Someone spray-painted trespasser across the old launch ramp beside my shoreline property overnight. A fake social media account started posting edited photographs claiming I was trying to shut down public lake access entirely. One picture even showed me standing beside the maintenance shed with a caption calling me the crazy lake guy destroying local businesses. The whole thing would have been funny if it was not so obvious. Vanessa was trying to isolate me socially before legal pressure arrived. Classic HOA warfare. But the real escalation happened Friday night. I woke up around 1:20 in the morning to the sound of engines growling outside the property gate. Deep diesel engines. Heavy vehicles. The air inside the cabin smelled like rain-soaked wood and stale coffee, while distant thunder rolled across the lake. I stepped onto the porch and immediately saw headlights moving along the western shoreline access road. 3 trucks. Large construction floodlights mounted on top. My stomach tightened instantly. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the shoreline through wet grass still slick from evening rain. Water dripped steadily from the cypress trees while mud sucked against my boots with every step. The closer I got, the louder the machinery sounded. Metallic clanking, hydraulic hissing, men shouting over diesel engines. Then the floodlights hit me. Bright white construction lights exploded across the dark shoreline, revealing exactly what Silver Pines was trying to do. 2 excavation crews were driving steel retaining barriers directly into the western shoreline beside the runoff channel. Fresh concrete forms already lined part of the water access route connected to my federal maintenance easement. They were trying to physically wall off the protected spillway entrance overnight before inspections could happen. One worker froze the second he recognized me. Another quickly looked away. Nobody there wanted eye contact, because deep down they all knew this was illegal. I walked straight through the mud toward the nearest excavator while diesel smoke burned the back of my throat. Who authorized this? I shouted over the machinery. The foreman climbed down slowly from the equipment, wiping rainwater off his hard hat. He looked exhausted. Guilty too. County shoreline stabilization permit, he muttered. I held my flashlight directly toward the steel barriers half buried beside the water. Federal survey markers sat less than 15 feet away. This is protected flood control access. The man avoided eye contact immediately. I just follow orders. Of course he did. Everybody around Silver Pines followed orders as long as the checks cleared. I pulled my phone out and started recording everything. Equipment serial numbers, concrete forms, shoreline positions, every illegal inch of it. One of the younger workers finally muttered under his breath, "Man, this whole thing feels wrong." He was right, because this was no longer HOA harassment anymore. They were actively altering federally protected water infrastructure in the middle of the night to protect a luxury marina. Rain kept falling harder while diesel engines echoed across Blackwater Ridge and muddy runoff slid directly into the water beside the spillway. Standing there under construction floodlights with illegal shoreline barriers rising around me, I finally understood exactly how far Vanessa Holloway was willing to go to protect Silver Pines. And for the first time since buying the lake, I realized this situation was becoming dangerous in a completely different way. Rain hammered the metal roof of the maintenance shed hard enough to sound like gravel pouring from the sky. I sat alone at the old wooden workbench surrounded by stacks of flood maps, engineering reports, and damp survey records while a single yellow lamp cast long shadows across the room. The entire shed smelled like wet cedar, machine grease, and lake water soaked into old timber over decades. Outside, thunder rolled low across Blackwater Ridge while runoff streams carved through the muddy shoreline toward the spillway channels. I barely noticed the storm anymore. My attention stayed locked on the document spread open beneath my hands. Because after 3 straight nights digging through my father's old records, I had finally found the one thing Silver Pines never realized existed. The paper itself looked ancient. Thick yellow survey stock folded inside a waterproof Army Corps archive sleeve dated September 14, 1974. Across the top sat the faded federal seal I recognized immediately from my years working infrastructure contracts. Underneath it were words that made my pulse slow down instantly. Emergency Floodwater Preservation Jurisdiction. I leaned back in the chair listening to rain hammer against the roof while I reread the clause for at least the 10th time. The language was dry, technical, easy for ordinary people to ignore. But buried halfway through the document sat a federal enforcement provision connected directly to navigable floodwater infrastructure. Any shoreline owner maintaining designated spillway access retained authority to request immediate federal environmental intervention if private marina operations endangered flood control runoff systems or protected watershed channels. I stared at the page for a long moment while lightning flashed outside the shed windows. Then I finally understood what my father had been trying to protect all those years. Blackwater Ridge was never just a lake. It was part of a federally managed emergency overflow chain designed after the devastating floods of 1972 destroyed farmland west of the county. That old spillway everybody ignored behind Silver Pines connected directly into downstream agricultural water routes protected under federal infrastructure preservation law, which meant the moment contamination entered those channels, local politics stopped mattering entirely. My father knew it. Somehow Vanessa Holloway never bothered checking. The smell of old paper and machine oil filled the room while I carefully unfolded another document beneath the lamp. Original spillway engineering diagrams, hand-signed by Army Corps supervisors. My father's notes still covered the margins in faded blue ink. Flow pressure measurements, erosion warnings, fuel contamination risk assessments. The handwriting hit me harder than I expected. For a second I could practically hear his voice again, explaining current velocity while we drifted through morning fog 20 years earlier. Water always wins eventually, Luke. I used to think he meant nature. Sitting there alone in the storm surrounded by federal records nobody remembered existed anymore. I finally realized he meant truth. Around midnight, headlights swept across the shed windows. I instinctively killed the lamp and stepped quietly toward the door. Rain poured sideways across the shoreline while a dark SUV idled near the western access road. Not a county vehicle. Not Marina security either. The driver stepped out slowly holding a flashlight low against the storm. Tall guy. Mid-40s maybe. Work boots instead of polished Marina loafers. He raised one hand carefully when he saw me. You Lucas Mercer? The rain soaked both of us within seconds while thunder cracked across the lake again. Depends who is asking. He gave a tired half-smile. Name is Daniel Reeves. I used to manage fuel maintenance for Silver Pines. My stomach tightened immediately. The man looked exhausted. Water dripped from his jacket while diesel fumes rolled faintly off the SUV behind him. Vanessa fired me yesterday. There it was. I stayed quiet, letting him continue. They know you are building a federal case. He glanced nervously toward the eastern shoreline lights glowing through the rain. And they are panicking. We stepped inside the shed while rain hammered the roof hard enough to shake dust loose from the rafters. Daniel dropped a thick waterproof folder onto the workbench beside my maps. The smell of damp paper and gasoline drifted out immediately. Maintenance logs, he muttered. Fuel leak reports. Internal emails. Dock inspections. I opened the folder slowly and immediately felt my heartbeat change. Every single thing I suspected sat right there in black and white. Unreported fuel system failures. Emergency patch repairs instead of full replacements. Staff complaints ignored by Marina management for almost 6 years. One report documented direct leakage near the northern runoff channels during holiday boat traffic peaks. Another warned that shoreline expansion docks had shifted outside approved anchor zones. After flood erosion weakened the retaining barriers. My eyes stopped on one particular document signed personally by Richard Holloway. Delay reporting until after holiday season to avoid negative publicity. I looked up slowly. They knew. Daniel nodded once. They always knew. Thunder rattled the windows again, while the old flood maps fluttered slightly across the workbench. Why bring this to me? He stared toward the spillway diagrams pinned beside the wall. Because last week they ordered us to bury contamination lines near the western channel before inspectors arrived. His voice lowered. And because my grandfather lost his farm in the '72 flood. That sentence hung in the room heavier than the storm outside. Suddenly, everything connected. The flood system, the spillway protections, the old federal clauses. This lake carried history deeper than luxury homeowners understood. Daniel rubbed rainwater from his face, looking completely drained. They think money fixes everything, he muttered quietly. But water keeps records longer than people do. I looked back down at the maintenance logs spread across the workbench while thunder rolled again across Blackwater Ridge. Fuel contamination, illegal shoreline barriers, buried infrastructure violations, and now deliberate concealment tied directly to federally protected floodwater systems. The entire Silver Pines empire suddenly looked very different under the yellow glow of that old maintenance shed lamp. Because this was no longer an HOA dispute anymore. It was a federal infrastructure violation sitting on top of environmental fraud. And for the first time since buying the lake, I realized I finally had enough evidence to bring the whole marina down. By Monday morning, the entire atmosphere around Blackwater Ridge had changed. You could feel it the second sunlight touched the marina water. The confidence was gone. Silver Pines still looked beautiful from a distance with its polished docks, white yachts, and oversized lake houses reflecting across the shoreline. But underneath all that luxury sat pure panic. Workers moved faster now. Maintenance crews suddenly appeared around the fuel station before sunrise. Security guards started patrolling in pairs instead of alone. Even the residents looked nervous driving their golf carts past the marina office. Nobody knew exactly what was happening yet, but rich communities can smell trouble long before they admit it exists. I spent the morning installing motion cameras along the western shoreline near the spillway channels. The old flood control access road had almost disappeared beneath weeds and cracked concrete over the years, but every inch of it still legally mattered. The smell of wet grass and diesel fuel hung in the humid air while insects buzzed around the shoreline reeds beside me. Every few minutes another speedboat ripped across the lake, throwing waves against the old dock posts hard enough to make the entire shoreline shudder. Silver Pines was trying to act normal. But normal communities do not suddenly pour fresh gravel over runoff trenches at 6 in the morning. Daniel Reeves showed up just after noon carrying another waterproof storage case in the back of his truck. Sweat soaked through his gray work shirt while thunderclouds gathered again over the western hills beyond the lake. He looked exhausted. Like a man who had not slept properly in days. "You need to see this," he muttered quietly. Inside the case sat hard drives, maintenance tablets, and printed marina inspection records dating back nearly 8 years. The second I opened the files, the scale of the problem became obvious. Internal reports documented fuel leaks during holiday weekends going back almost half a decade. Temporary repairs repeatedly failed near the northern dock expansion. One inspection even warned that continued runoff contamination could trigger federal review if shoreline ownership disputes ever surfaced. Richard Holloway personally approved suppressing the report. I stared at the screen while heat shimmered outside the maintenance shed windows. They buried all of this. Daniel nodded once. Most employees never saw the full records. The old ceiling fan above us rattled slowly while storm winds pushed humid air through the open doorway. Vanessa only cared about appearances, he continued. As long as the marina looked perfect, nothing else mattered. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because it explained everything about Silver Pines. The fake smiles, the manicured lawns, the obsession with property values and image control. Communities like this spend millions hiding problems instead of fixing them. But infrastructure does not care about appearances. Pipes corrode anyway. Fuel lines fail anyway. Water keeps moving anyway. Around 3 that afternoon, I launched my father's old aluminum survey boat into the western channel for the first time in years. The engine coughed twice before finally rumbling alive beneath the afternoon heat. I still remembered the exact smell of that motor from childhood. Burned fuel, hot metal, and lake water mixing together under the Texas sun. I guided the boat slowly through the narrow runoff corridor while cameras mounted along the rail recorded every inch of shoreline. Most of the marina residents probably assumed I was fishing. Let them think that. The farther north I moved, the worse the evidence became. Fresh erosion scars lined the runoff banks near Silver Pines dock extensions. Concrete debris from the illegal retaining wall project had partially collapsed into the flood channel after the storm. Worst of all, thin oily residue still drifted steadily through the protected current despite the Marina crews trying desperately to clean it overnight. I recorded everything: GPS coordinates, water movement, contamination flow direction, structural damage near federal spillway markers. Every detail mattered now. Halfway through the survey route, I heard another engine approaching fast behind me. A white Marina patrol boat cut across the water, throwing hard wakes against my hull before stopping less than 20 feet away. Vanessa stood near the front railing wearing oversized sunglasses despite the dark clouds building overhead. Two security guards sat behind her, looking uncomfortable already. "You are entering restricted community waters again," she shouted over the engine noise. I almost smiled hearing that phrase now. Restricted community waters. She still did not understand how badly she misunderstood federal lake jurisdiction. "Actually," I replied calmly while adjusting the survey camera, "I am documenting protected runoff infrastructure." Her jaw tightened instantly. "You need to stop filming residents immediately." I slowly pointed toward the northern dock extensions behind her, where steel pilings stretched directly across old federal shoreline markers half buried in the reeds. "Those docks are illegally positioned inside protected flood access boundaries." The younger security guard visibly shifted in his seat after hearing that. Good. Fear spreads faster than confidence once people realize lawyers may get involved. Vanessa stepped closer, gripping the rail hard enough for her knuckles to whiten slightly. "You think some old paperwork gives you power over this community?" Wind pushed harder across the lake, now carrying the smell of rain and fuel across the water between us. I looked past her toward the Marina clubhouse, where workers suddenly started removing temporary fuel tanks beside the dock ramps. "Too late for that now." "No," I answered quietly. "Federal infrastructure law does." Thunder cracked loudly overhead almost the exact second I said it. The entire lake seemed to vibrate beneath the sound. Vanessa stared at me silently for several seconds while dark storm clouds swallowed the afternoon sunlight behind her Marina. Then, for the first time since this whole situation started, I saw genuine fear break through the entitlement on her face. Because deep down she finally realized something terrifying. I was not bluffing. And worse than that, I knew exactly what I was doing. She turned sharply toward the patrol driver. "Let us go." The Marina boat accelerated hard across the water, leaving rough wakes rocking my little survey boat violently behind them. Rain started falling moments later. Heavy warm drops splashing against the aluminum hull while thunder echoed across Blackwater Ridge again. I sat there alone in the middle of the runoff channel watching Silver Pines Marina through sheets of rain slowly blur across the distance. Luxury houses, expensive docks, perfect landscaping. An entire community built on the assumption that money could overpower infrastructure law. But now I had the contamination records, the maintenance logs, the federal clauses, the shoreline surveys, and most importantly, proof that Silver Pines knowingly concealed violations tied directly into protected floodwater systems. Sitting there in the rain beside the old spillway current my father spent half his life protecting, I finally understood something clearly. The Marina was already finished. They just did not know it yet. Memorial Day weekend arrived with perfect weather and the kind of fake happiness rich communities love showing off online. By Saturday afternoon, Silver Pines Marina looked like a floating resort advertisement. Boats packed every dock slip. Red, white, and blue decorations hung from balconies overlooking the water. Music blasted from the clubhouse patio while golf carts rolled nonstop along the shoreline paths carrying coolers full of beer and expensive catered food. The smell of grilled steak, sunscreen, gasoline, and lake water mixed together beneath the hot Texas sun. From a distance, nobody would have guessed the entire marina was sitting on top of a federal disaster waiting to explode. I stood alone near the western shoreline under the shade of an old cedar tree, watching everything through binoculars while dragonflies drifted above the reeds beside me. My father used to sit in this exact spot during holiday weekends because it gave the clearest view across the flood channels and marina approaches. Funny how some places remember people long after they are gone. The old aluminum survey boat floated quietly behind me tied beside the dock, while water sensors blinked steadily along the spillway current. Every camera was active, every shoreline coordinate logged. Every contamination report uploaded. Weeks of evidence now sat inside federal databases far outside Richard Holloway's little county influence network. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated once inside my pocket. One message. Federal review request accepted. Enforcement deployment authorized. I stared at the screen for several seconds while warm wind moved through the trees overhead. No excitement. No celebration. Just calm. The kind that settles into your chest once you realize the outcome is no longer in anybody's hands. Across the lake, Silver Pines kept partying like nothing could touch them. Vanessa Holloway stood near the Marina clubhouse greeting residents in another perfectly pressed white outfit, while photographers snapped pictures beside the waterfront. Children waved small American flags near the kayak launch. A live band played country music under a giant tent beside the fuel docks. Luxury boats crowded the marina entrance so tightly they barely had room to maneuver. Richard Holloway shook hands near the upper deck bar like he was campaigning for governor. They truly believed they survived the storm. Then the helicopters arrived. The sound reached the lake before anybody saw them. Deep, rhythmic thumping echoing across the water from somewhere beyond the western hills. At first, most residents ignored it. Memorial Day always brought extra lake patrol traffic. But then 2 dark federal helicopters swept low across Blackwater Ridge directly toward the marina, while sunlight flashed across government markings beneath the fuselage. Music from the marina band slowly stopped. Conversations died one by one along the docks. Every head on the shoreline tilted upward simultaneously. I lowered the binoculars slowly while wind from the rotors rippled hard across the water. Seconds later, 3 white federal enforcement boats appeared from the southern flood channel, moving in tight formation directly towards Silver Pines Marina. Coast Guard markings. Environmental protection units. Federal waterway enforcement. The entire mood of the lake changed instantly. Panic spreads fast in wealthy communities because nobody there ever expects consequences to arrive publicly. Marina employees started running between the fuel docks and clubhouse. Residents scrambled toward their boats. Somebody cut the music entirely. The helicopters hovered low enough now that dust and loose decorations whipped violently across the marina decks. Then came the loudspeakers. Attention, Silver Pines Marina. Federal environmental enforcement operations are now active. All marina traffic is suspended immediately. You could actually hear people gasping across the water. I watched one yacht owner nearly drop his drink straight into the lake. The enforcement boats moved with mechanical precision. Officers secured fuel dock access points first. Then came the floating barriers. Bright orange federal containment booms rolled directly across the marina entrance, while inspectors photographed shoreline structures and runoff channels from every angle imaginable. Nobody resisted because by then everyone understood this was far beyond local law enforcement. Vanessa Holloway stormed down the central dock screaming at the nearest federal officer while her sunglasses bounced against her collar. Even from across the lake, I could hear parts of it. This is private property. You cannot do this. Do you know who my husband is? The federal officer barely reacted. He simply handed her a thick waterproof enforcement packet while 2 environmental inspectors walked past her toward the fuel station carrying contamination equipment. Richard Holloway looked even worse. His face had gone completely pale standing near the marina office, while federal agents photographed maintenance records already seized from inside the building. I could almost pinpoint the exact second he realized Daniel Reeves had talked. The marina itself became chaos within minutes. Luxury boats trapped behind containment barriers idled helplessly near the docks, while frustrated owners shouted at enforcement crews. Fuel operations shut down completely. Inspectors marked shoreline sections with bright federal warning tape. One environmental team began testing runoff flow directly beside the illegal retaining barriers Silver Pines installed during the night construction operation. I sat quietly beneath the cedar tree watching the entire thing unfold while warm lake wind pushed small waves against the shoreline beside my boots. The smell of gasoline still drifted faintly across the water beneath the scent of hot concrete and boat exhaust. Somewhere overhead, one of the helicopters circled slowly above the marina entrance while sunlight flashed across the spinning blades. Then my phone rang. Unknown federal number. I answered calmly. Mr. Mercer? Speaking. This is Deputy Director Alan Pierce with Regional Waterway Enforcement. We would like to formally thank you for preserving the original flood control records tied to Blackwater Ridge. I looked across the water toward the marina where Vanessa Holloway stood frozen beside a federal containment barrier blocking access to her precious docks. My father preserved them, I answered quietly. The deputy director paused briefly. Then your father probably saved this watershed. The call ended a few seconds later, leaving only the sound of helicopters, boat engines, and distant shouting echoing across the lake. I leaned back against the cedar trees staring at the water while the sun slowly dropped lower behind the western shoreline. For years, Silver Pines treated Blackwater Ridge like decoration. Something to exploit. Something to profit from. But lakes are not decorations. Water remembers every shortcut people bury beneath concrete and money. And now the same floodwater system my father spent decades protecting had finally done exactly what he always warned it would do. It exposed every lie sitting underneath the surface. 6 months later, Blackwater Ridge sounded different. No helicopters. No Marina loudspeakers. No drunken yacht parties echoing across the water at midnight. Just wind moving softly through the cypress trees and the steady rhythm of lake water brushing against the old wooden dock my father built almost 20 years earlier. Some mornings I still woke up before sunrise out of habit and sat alone near the western shoreline, holding a cup of black coffee while fog drifted low across the water exactly the way it used to when I was a kid. The smell out there had changed too. Cleaner now. Fresh mud, cedar bark, rainwater, and lake grass instead of gasoline and overheated boat engines. Funny how fast nature starts healing itself once people stop poisoning it. Silver Pines Marina estates barely existed anymore. The federal investigation spread faster than anyone expected once the environmental reports became public record. News crews showed up first, then lawyers, then insurance investigators. By the end of the summer, the county planning office was under review for permit. Irregularities tied to the marina expansion projects. Richard Holloway quietly resigned from the Planning Commission 3 weeks after the enforcement operation. Nobody around the county seemed shocked when financial conflict investigations followed shortly afterward. Vanessa tried fighting everything at first. She hired attorneys, filed complaints, gave angry interviews blaming government overreach and misinterpreted regulations. But federal infrastructure law does not care about social status or HOA influence, especially once contamination records and concealed maintenance reports enter evidence. One by one, the luxury dock systems were dismantled under federal supervision. Fuel pumps disappeared first. Then came the illegal shoreline barriers. Finally, the floating marina extensions themselves were removed section by section until huge stretches of eastern shoreline sat exposed for the first time in years. I watched most of it happen from the old survey boat drifting quietly through the spillway channels. The strange thing was, I never felt satisfaction watching them lose everything. Mostly I just felt tired. Because none of this had needed to happen. If Vanessa and Richard had respected the lake instead of treating it like private decoration, Blackwater Ridge could have supported everyone peacefully for decades. But entitlement blinds people, especially wealthy people who mistake ownership for control. One cool October morning, I walked down to the restored western shoreline, while volunteers from the County Conservation Department unloaded native cypress saplings beside the runoff channels. Children from a local school helped plant shoreline grass near the old flood easements while retired farmers from West County repaired erosion fencing along the spillway banks. The entire lake felt alive again. Real. Not staged for real estate brochures anymore. Just water, trees, mud, and people finally treating the place with respect. Daniel Reeves stayed involved through most of the restoration work too. Turns out losing his marina job ended up saving his life financially because once the federal lawsuit started, nearly every executive tied to Silver Pines operations became radioactive in the local business community. One afternoon, he stood beside me watching workers rebuild part of the public launch ramp near the western channel. The smell of fresh-cut lumber drifted through the cold air while ducks skimmed low across the water nearby. "Your father would have liked this," he said quietly. I stared across the lake toward the eastern shoreline where the old Marina clubhouse once stood. Federal closure notices still covered most of the windows. "He would have hated how much it cost to fix," I answered. Daniel laughed harder than I expected at that. The truth was, Blackwater Ridge never really belonged to me. Not completely anyway. Lakes like this belong to time more than people. My father understood that long before I did. You protect them for a while, maintain them, respect them, then eventually you pass them forward. By winter, the county officially redesignated large sections of the shoreline as protected conservation water access under federal runoff preservation oversight. Public fishing areas reopened near the western banks for the first time in almost 15 years. Families started showing up at sunrise carrying folding chairs, tackle boxes, and thermoses of coffee exactly the same way my father and I used to. Some weekends I helped kids untangle fishing lines near the dock, while cold wind rolled across the water carrying the smell of cedar smoke from nearby campsites. Nobody there cared about yacht slips or marina memberships anymore. They just cared that the lake was alive again. The last time I saw Vanessa Holloway was early December. Gray clouds hung low over Blackwater Ridge, while freezing rain tapped softly against the roof of the old maintenance shed. She stood alone beside the abandoned eastern dock entrance wearing a long dark coat, instead of her usual white outfits. The marina behind her looked hollow now. Empty slips, silent walkways, federal warning signs hanging where luxury banners once stood. She looked older somehow. Smaller too. We stood there quietly for several seconds listening to water slap against the abandoned dock posts. Finally, she spoke without looking at me. "Do you enjoy this?" The question lingered in the cold air between us. I thought about it honestly before answering. The helicopters, the investigations, the lawsuits, the ruined reputations, the marina collapse. Then I looked out across Blackwater Ridge, where winter fog drifted slowly through the restored spillway channels while hundreds of migrating birds settled quietly across the water. "No," I said calmly. "But the lake does." She frowned slightly at that like she did not understand. Maybe she never would. Vanessa spent years believing ownership came from money, influence, and control. But water does not recognize any of those things. Water only responds to the people willing to protect it. She eventually walked away without another word, disappearing slowly into the cold fog surrounding the empty marina parking lot. I stayed behind, standing near the old shoreline markers while freezing rain tapped softly against the dock beneath my boots. Somewhere out across Blackwater Ridge, a fish jumped near the reeds, breaking the surface with a quiet splash. The sound echoed gently through the fog exactly the same way it did when I was 10 years old sitting beside my father before sunrise. And in that moment, standing beside the restored water he spent half his life trying to protect, I finally understood something simple. Silver Pines thought they owned the lake because they built expensive houses beside it. But in the end, the lake remembered who actually fought for it.